welcome everybody. I'd like to begin by thanking you, Connie, and Defense One for just a terrific program today. And importantly, for your vision in including this open source discussion, which I expect will be one of the most thought-provoking discussions we're going to have today. When I think about the military strategy we embarked upon many years ago, we decided we were going to prevail through information advantage and precision strike. And yet when we conceived that, nobody considered that CNN was going to bring the first Gulf War into our living room, live, real time. And certainly no one would have contemplated that social media would enable 250,000 Egyptians to self-organize, mobilize their 2011 revolution. There was a Tahrir Square Facebook page. So today, we're working to provide our national security apparatus with information advantage in a world of real-time, ubiquitous access to information. This is an area in which Accenture is investing heavily for both our national security clients as well as globally. We believe information advantage, whether it's in national security or in managing the humanitarian consequence of an infectious disease outbreak, is enabled by applying information integration, analytics, and visualization at a scale that was previously unimaginable. Our intelligence community has increasingly focused on the rising importance of open source intelligence, recognizing its value in enhancing situational awareness and understanding, improving indications and warning, and broadly helping our federal clients achieve their missions. That growth is undeniable, and it continues to grow at an unprecedented rate. And yet I wonder, has capability and technology gotten ahead of policy and law in this space? And I expect you'll hear more about that as we explore the topic. Following the panel, you're in for a real treat. A new member of Accenture's family, Lieutenant General retired Mary Legier, who most recently served as the Army's most senior intelligence officer. We'll also share her insights on how we collectively might enable our intelligence community to accelerate expansion in this critical domain. So thank you very much. I hope you enjoy the conversation.
Hey, thank you very much. Great to see you all back for this. With me today is Elmo Wright. He is the Senior OSNIT Advisor at Army Intelligence Command. OSNIT is open source intelligence. Hopefully, not everybody throws around terms like that, but OSNIT is something that we'll be talking about pretty much nonstop for the next 45 minutes. John Scott, over there, Lead Defense Department Open Technology Development. Next to him, Art Toller, an analyst with Bellingcat, and we'll talk about what that is in a second. And Chris Rasmussen, who is with NGA, and he's the program manager at the Pathfinder program. So who here, let me start with you, Art. Who here knows what Bellingcat is? Raise your hand. Okay, that's good. Good, we got a few hands. So this is a group of people that I go to all the time for sourcing, to know what's true and what's not true. It's basically a collective of folks all around the world taking a look at open source intelligence, stuff you can find online, stuff that shows up on YouTube, stuff that shows up in Google Images, stuff that shows up in newspapers, stuff that shows up in foreign news sites, figuring out what's true and what's not. And they had a pretty remarkable effect on the international discussion about who shot down MH Flight 17. So there was a lot of finger pointing this way and that. There were a lot of denials by a lot of different parties. There were a lot of accusations flying. Now, Eric, I think to start us out and help everybody understand about the power of open source intelligence right now, tell us a little bit about that investigation, what you guys did, and the outcome of that.
Yeah, sure. Oh, good, the mic works. It's magic. So when you think about most atrocities and things over time, like for example the Lockerbie case, there's not a whole lot of information that the average person with internet connection can really do. So if you're researching the Lockerbie case or some other atrocity, I mean, you have maybe a few photos and videos and newspaper accounts, that's about it. But MH17, Malaysian Airlines Flight 17, if you remember, 298 people died July 17, 2014. It crashed over eastern Ukraine because there was a massive amount of information online. Not just a few photos and videos of from the Buk anti-aircraft missile system that was in Ukraine on that day, but also going back weeks, because in Russia and Ukraine, as you guys may know if you look for the funny YouTube videos, everyone has dash cams, little cameras on their dashboard. And so because of that, you have a little spy all around the world in a lot of ways. So what we did with that is me and a handful of other people in a collective of Dutch, Finnish, German, British volunteers and enthusiasts. We gathered over hundreds and thousands of hours. We scoured the deepest corners of the internet and found more or less exactly what anti-aircraft systems shot down MH17. For thousands of hours, we researched, looking at pretty much every video that's been posted on for about 3 weeks in Russia and the border area before, and we were able to trace a convoy that transported this big green monster, this Buk anti-aircraft system, towards the Ukrainian border from June 23rd and 25th, about 3 weeks before the downing. And then we compared that up against witness reports that appeared online, social media, satellite images, witness accounts from Russian and English language social media, Kontakte, Naklasniki, YouTube, Facebook, Twitter, and so on. Mm-hmm. And so by doing this, we're able to collect all this information and bring it together. This is kind of a vacuum of kind of the modern state of journalism, is that you have newsrooms that are depleting, you have less resources for hard investigative journalism. And so what we had is kind of a volunteer collective of enthusiasts who were able to spend hundreds and thousands of hours. If you're a journalist, you probably can't sell this to your editor, to spend hundreds of thousands of hours to research this. So we kind of filled a vacuum of collecting all this information, collaborating and analyzing it, and then coming to the conclusion of pointing our finger at exactly which anti-aircraft system shot down the plane, who were the people who were involved in the transport, what is the exact timeline, satellite images that back it up, and we passed all that to the Dutch investigation that's researching into the MH17.
And they came to the conclusion that...
Of more or less exactly what we said.
When did they come to that official conclusion?
A couple months ago. They released their first, they did a forensic report going back about a year ago, and the first criminal report came out a couple months ago, and it confirmed more or less the correct launch site that we pointed to, and also the identity of the anti-aircraft system that was the weapon.
So, and how much did your investigation cost financially?
Oh, about $0 maybe.
Okay.
Yeah, it's volunteer. We have all volunteers, and that's kind of the strength, and in a way, strength and weakness is that we have all volunteers, so people can do it in their free time, and it's kind of a self-selecting group of people who are interested in this. But obviously the weakness is that we're hamstrung by our microscopic budget, because Bellingcat began as a crowdsourced project, or Elliot Rand. He raised around 50,000 pounds to launch the site. And we have got a couple of funding projects since then, but it's really kind of a very shoestring budget of about 2 full-time staff, me and Elliot. And we've gotten a recent couple more infusions, but that's really about it.
Okay, so from the cost of the investigation is nominal. The output is actual report from Dutch government that has geopolitical significance. That is the future of open source intelligence. And now I'd like to go down the line and have everybody talk a little bit about what they do and how they see the future of open source intelligence evolving. Very quick, because we want to bring in audience questions very early, but Elmo, tell us a little bit about what you do.
So good afternoon, and thanks for being here, and thanks for inviting me to be here. I just want to caveat my remarks to start off with that these are my personal views and not the official views of the U.S. Army. And even though they let me come here and are going to pay me to be here today, I want to tell you a little bit about INSCOM's place in Army intelligence, and then sort of cycle through challenges that we think about for training for Army soldiers. So the Intelligence and Security Command is a sort of a part of the tripartite part of the U.S. Army intelligence community. The G2 of the Army, General Gier, her former job, now Lieutenant General Robert Ashley, his job. The official member of the Army as part of the intelligence community sets policy, programs, resourcing. And the Intelligence and Security Command provides operationally a lot of that work that the G2 asks us to do. And then our other partner is the Intelligence Center of Excellence out at Fort Huachuca, setting doctrine and training. We have a lot of, at INSCOM, there's a lot of efforts going on to do open source intelligence, OSINT, and to make value out of that for the U.S. Army. As you guys probably all know, it's relatively cheap, as Eric just said. And so there's a great return on investment. You're not putting people in harm's way as if you would for human intelligence. You're not having to spend a lot of money as if you were going to launch satellites. And so great return on investment, but you have to train people in order to do this properly and legally. Those of you who are familiar with the Department of Defense guidance here know that Secretary Carter and the Attorney General recently signed a new DoD manual, 5240, which is the manual that governs intelligence activities on the part of the Department of Defense. So a lot of effort on our part here at the Intelligence and Security Command to provide training to soldiers to do this safely, legally, responsibly. OSINT, in some ways, uses some of those same technologies that Eric has talked about, and the range of technologies to pay attention to publicly available information, PAI. You'll hear that phrase again as we talk here today. A lot of that effort is to train people to use publicly available information in a way that is not HUMINT and is not SIGINT and is not cyber. It is openly available to soldiers working on their government information systems back in their home station, making use of the fact that they are now providing intelligence, and they don't have to go forward into hostile environments. They don't have to change their badges or whatever. They're working that at their home station. That's a big part of the job that we have at the Intelligence and Security Command, is making sure that that training, those tools, and that technology are properly provisioned to folks. Okay. I'm looking forward to the dialogue, and very complimentary of my colleague Chris Rasmussen. His work, his team of guys at the NGA have done great work. Big fans of Bellingcat, and really hope that the USCI continues to fund us there with good tools and technology. So thank you again for the opportunity to be here.
Thanks. So Chris and John, very quickly, who you are and how you relate to open source intelligence.
Sure. The Pathfinder program came out of the look at, from NGA's perspective, of the very aggressive small satellite launch schedule pending on the horizon, and what is our agency's value proposition in a highly commercialized and commoditized space. So it was based on a business strategy, and they're always imperfect in government, but often when a product or service doesn't match the mainline headquarters business, is to spin off a separate entity so the headquarters kind of doesn't love it to death. What we needed to disconnect from was the classified mothership, to drive out what the operating environment is going to look like for our organization in a highly commoditized and commercialized space. So we disconnected from the mothership, and we use only unclassified everything to drive out new value for the organization, when to be open and when to be closed. So we do certain missions in public. It's not always appropriate to run the closed methodology in every single case. A lot of our methodology is based around one of the old OSINT jokes from '95 during the Bosnian conflict, when people would go, "They will know we're interested in Bosnia. Don't you think our 50,000 troops there tells them that?" So we put our names on certain things. We explain to companies that we're using their data exactly what we're going to do with it. With strategic analysis, these fantastically boring infrastructure questions, we're asking the same questions as hedge funds in many, many cases, and we can steer into and have the most inclusive conversations with industry because our discipline is commoditizing and commercializing so much, and that's what the Pathfinder does. The next step with us is co-creation. So unclassified is not the new secret. What we're working on is a thing called the coffee strategy. So our goal is to deliver highly tailored, highly strategic analysis to a mobile device hours before our people enter a secure environment. So if we can answer 80 or 90% of the question before they come into what they call the skiff, that's the goal, while somebody's drinking their morning coffee. So the analysis that was done in Pathfinder is pumping through those systems. We're identifying the right groups with the attitude and aptitude to feed that, and that's the strategy. With partnerships, we can have partnerships with industry, and I hope with Bellingcat, so we can grow broad networks. We need all the help we can get on the unclassified side to do this, and we shouldn't overachieve with closed methodology and kind of the self-imposed spookiness that often happens in the intelligence community. Keep the main thing the main thing. So I'd like to talk about partnerships with growing this kind of content. We'll have to work on some public citation systems if you're coming into the coffee strategy system. But I think that's very, very reasonable, and we need to be transparent so we don't run into the green door problem of people think that something is going on that's just unbelievably spooky behind the door. Open source is pounding the keyboard and hustle in many, many cases. You cannot buy yourself way out of this problem. You need the right people with the right attitude and aptitude to do it.
All right, and John, you know, it's fun to talk about all of these amazing images that show up on YouTube, on Google, and how you can use those to achieve effects, but it doesn't work without the hardware, without the software, without the bandwidth. Tell us a little bit about what you do.
Yeah, so John Scott. So I primarily work with DoD and OSD and members of the intelligence community around policies and procedures and processes around how to use open source technologies. So everybody familiar with open source software? So I mean, I think that all the analysis that's basically being done by everybody up here is becoming commoditized. I mean, Chris mentioned it specifically, commoditization. I mean, that's really where technology is going nowadays. NGA specifically, I mean, you've got a lot of projects there that are based on open source software, open source GIS, imagery systems, and things like that. That's where all the, to say fun words, that's where all the cool kids are playing now. So technology is really becoming commodity kind of going forward. So the question always becomes, well, how do you trust it? How do you know that there's not something bad in there? I mean, the first question is always, well, you can see the source code. So what we're seeing is a lot about how do we actually move into this environment? What are the organizational constructs around how technology gets absorbed by large organizations? Organized, maintained, used going forward. What are the rights and rules around that from the intellectual property perspective? So that's one of the things we've been working on is how do you kind of drive this behavior in, which is basically being pulled in, and that's what's really giving a lot of the speed to analysis and the speed to mission and to basically meet the mission needs that are going forward. Because no longer, we don't have time to put out an RFP for analysis to build an analysis system that's going to take 2 years to build. We basically know we can do it because we've seen it on Google, we've seen it on YouTube and those things like that. So how do we bring in the best practices of industry into the intelligence community and the government and the military at large?
Okay, so folks, because we're talking about open source intelligence, and going out into the broader world and finding the data that's relevant to us and actually making use of it, I'm going to open it up for questions as I ask questions. So if you have a question, go ahead and raise your hand and we'll get the mic to you. And feel free to participate just as they come to you. Feel free to dive right in. And but first, you see, it's good. We got some folks raising your hand. But first, let me start with you, Eric, because this is kind of a tricky proposition when we talk about an international collective of folks that doing volunteer work to have a geopolitical outcome. There was a bit of a cost to that, right? There was you and Elliot and a few others. You received some unwanted cyber attention from a source within Russia that gave you some spearfishing attempt. Is that right? I recall reading that from Trade Connect.
They tried. So if most people I assume are familiar with Fancy Bear, which is the Russian group that was linked to the DNC hack. So yeah, it's us. It's not just us alone. It's also a lot of think tanks and journalists and so on. Me and two other people in Bellingcat, we received a bunch of what we thought were just junk mail, like spearfishing attempts. Like it looked like they were a Google alert saying, there's been a login attempt on your account. Click here and reset your password. And of course, you click it, it sends you, and they steal your password, right? And yeah, we were targeted by somebody who is Russian. How close the links are to the Russian government is still, that's not for me to answer. But it's the same group that was involved with the DNC hack, and of course what they took from John Podesta and others ended up on WikiLeaks. Mm-hmm. Thankfully, none of us clicked the emails, so my inbox is not on WikiLeaks right now, thank goodness. No, they'd be very bored, I think, if they did. So yeah, we were targeted again. It's luckily, again, like I said earlier, we're kind of a self-selecting group. People are interested in this. Usually we're relatively tech savvy. So we didn't do any bad clicking, but yeah, we've obviously gained the interest of some people who make a lot more money than we do.
So this is an important point because we're talking about information that individuals create and they put on the internet, information that's then looked at by volunteers all around the world to have an effect. And this is the idea that the battle space, that the conflict space is confined to very specifically where we've decided to put forces. This is an obsolete notion. If you look at where the discussions we're having right now about geopolitical events, and that's really key. So one of the things that I'm also very curious about, and Emily, you can talk a little bit to this. I have Facebook, and every day I see more and more just sort of not true things showing up on Facebook. And in terms of open source intelligence, you're dealing with this problem in a very specific, practical way because you have to constantly separate what is true from what is not. So, Eric, first I'd like to talk to you about how you see this trend in right now, because they're looking at Syria, they're looking at Iraq, this is places where you are, how you see fake, misleading, or misinformation in those two environments where, that are areas of responsibility for, right now for the United States where we've got a lot of troops, how you see the misinformation from those two places moving up. And Elmo, after that, if you could touch on sort of how the mill separates fake from non-fake in an environment where you have to do operations and still rely on open source intelligence.
Sure. I'll be fast so Elmo can get to this. So I'll, real quick for the Syria question, we do a lot of our work, nowadays probably the bulk of our work, regarding Syria and specifically about the ongoing Russian and American air campaigns there. And we do a lot of verification and fact checking because both the US-led coalition and Russian Air Force, they announce where they're doing their attacks. And we fact check the US coalition and the Russian coalition. So Russia says, oh, we did airstrikes in Syria, we attacked these ISIS targets, and we destroyed this oil refinery. Well, thanks to open source intelligence, we can very quickly look at the video they posted on the Ministry of Defense's YouTube account and see that this oil refinery in ISIS-held territory is actually a water refinery that's 200 kilometers away from ISIS-held territory. It's very, very quick and very easy verification. We do the same thing with the US, but they are much more truthful usually, consistent. But with fake news, I mean, that takes effort to go through and do all this verification work and double check it and so on. And our utopian visions, which probably aren't very true, but still utopian, is if we are very transparent and open about what our evidence is, if we show our work, we don't have any anonymous secret sources about W&Ds and this, that, and the other thing, there'll be more trust with the audience. And regarding Iraq, we also do a lot of work with kind of the people who are in the front lines of the fake news, or the journalists, the local journalists. So we do a lot of training sessions with, for example, I did a training session with some journalists who work in the Iraqi Kurdistan. And ever since then, they've started a news initiative, because fake news in Iraq, if you think it's bad here, it's god-awful there. And they do kind of a debunking force to where they look at ISIS or other propaganda, and they debunk it using open source information. So we're trying to spread the virus of open source because, of course, a lot of you guys do a lot of stuff with intel analysis, actionable stuff.
Yeah.
We see ourselves with us, open source intelligence isn't so much intelligence as resources or raw material to work more as journalists or fact checkers or verifiers, or more of a nonprofit kind of a thing rather than like a government intelligence agency.
Right.
So I feel like with the fake news, I feel like educating journalists a lot more on how to do some of this resource and this verification and fact checking would really help kind of stamping it out from the beginning.
Yeah.
But again, that's very utopian, and maybe I'm totally wrong, but I think that's worth a shot at least.
So how many people have heard the phrase, I read it on the internet? You know, if you're old enough, if you're old enough to have been around at the beginning of the internet, you thought that everything was real. I think the basic answer to your question there, Patrick, is that whenever you do all source intelligence, your open source intelligence is a component of fusing all sources of information that you're getting from other places.
Okay.
And so, Army purposes, defense intelligence purposes, I think other components of the defense intel enterprise, you're looking at all sources of information to be able to make a good judgment out, separating out what is real from what is untrue. Now, let me give you a couple of tweaks on OSINT about that. One is the alerting indications and warning function that you get from open source intelligence. If somebody sends out a tweet, if there's a Facebook post, if there's an upload of a YouTube video or something like that, that may be the first indication of something that happened. Clearly, if you track that through, as Eric has done, you can ultimately find out that, hey, what was on that YouTube video or what was on that posting on a newspaper story by a foreign media organization, not government executive, would actually, maybe be the right indications and warning, the right alerting function that something actually happened. But then you follow that up with, is it another source in open source intelligence? Is it another, do you have satellite confirmation? Do you have SIGINT confirmation? Whatever.
Right.
And then the other part that is a little bit of separation of fake news is not to go to Snopes or to PolitiFact, for example, but to separate out fake news from and long-term stuff is to take a look at the advantage of open source intelligence for long-term forecasting.
Yeah.
Long-term events that's happening. Typically, classified sources and methods, you're not going to get a lot of the same kind of long-term contextual, socio-political, economic understanding that you get as you do whenever you're looking at open source intelligence. So, yes, those things, SIGINT, imagery can help you sort out the real from the factual in terms of a long-term propaganda campaign.
Yeah.
But ultimately, that's probably going to reveal itself in open source intelligence regardless.
Yeah, hopefully. Okay, now we're going to questions. We've got one right here, red tie, kind of middle of the.
Hi, Rob Levinson, Bloomberg Government. A question that kind of gets to something Eric said about this business of fake news. Are you seeing, or do we expect to see, a reaction on the part of either governments or organizations of recognizing that they're now vulnerable to this kind of thing? They start to restrict your behavior. For example, one would expect that whenever the DNC selects a new chair, they're going to implement an email policy which says anything controversial, don't put it in an email, because they were hacked once. There's no reason to believe they won't be hacked again. The Republican Party did the same thing. So I wonder if we expect any sort of then, restricting organizations or governments saying, hey, don't put stuff where it's going to be vulnerable because of the potential impact. Thanks.
To take a stab at that, we in the intel community know, and you in the public media know, based upon some of the things that China, Russia, and Iran do as governments, is they are trying to, in some ways, separate and control their internet access from their private sectors, from the private citizen, from the rest of the general internet.
Yeah.
And so, from that standpoint, it's harder to get out from those venues, and China has made some public discussions about having specific access points into their internet. Russia doing the same thing. So, to get at your question a little bit, it's going to be harder in those countries for those citizens to have regular access to the internet, regular access to social media, and just one caveat here that I haven't mentioned before: social media is not the sum total of open source intelligence, and I think sometimes we collectively tend to think about social media and all of the privacy concerns and the U.S. person's information concerns about that as being getting the bulk of attention regarding open source intelligence, but that's not by any means the sum total of open source intelligence.
Chris, let me, on that, talk a little bit about Pathfinder. And we were talking about this earlier. Sometimes you think of NGA as like satellites and birds and things like that. And the amount of intel that you take and you bring together to create something, it's pretty broad.
Yeah, what we found in Pathfinder 1 and 2 was the majority of the questions that we looked at were answered with what we call ground analytic information. So people usually go, NGA, overhead imagery, go read out your imagery and do that job. Most of the questions were answered with social media analysis, volunteer geographic information analysis, financial analysis, and unstructured text analysis to get at a GeoInt question. Perfect example. We use Bloomberg Financial. On the tin, you wouldn't think that NGA investing in Bloomberg services, where's the GeoInt in that? Well, who's financing what construction projects and how buildings and roads are expanding is quintessential GEOINT. So it's not just going to read out your overhead and designing change detection services. So in Pathfinder, the disruption on the ground, what we've seen, is actually more disruptive than what's coming from the overhead change detection services from the space sector. So it's a combination of both, but it's not just NGA, go read out your imagery, invest in commercial overhead. There's a massive, what we call ground analytic component to the discipline.
So in answer to your question, Rob, this is a good point. It sounds like the intelligence community using the vast amount of open source intelligence, combining that with some more privileged, private, maybe clandestine intelligence, can come to a really high degree of certitude that what they're saying is true or what they're saying is not true. Importantly, the U.S. government faces a legal limitation in how they present that information to the public. So PR can say things. The president can speak from the pulpit, but U.S. Law 50 Code 3093, it's the Smith-Moot Act, we talked a little bit about this morning, prohibits the United States government from action intended to influence the United States political processes, public opinion, or media. So we have a bit of a legal barrier in the ability of the intelligence community to present or full findings to the public in a way that perhaps puts to bed uncertainty or unrest or questions about whether or not something is actually happening. It's the job of politicians to do that, and let's hope that they're telling the truth, and we don't think they are half the time. So go ahead. Yeah, microphone's coming to you.
Good afternoon. My name is Joel Wasserman. This question, I suppose, is particularly for Mr. Toller, but so particularly it seems with the Russians, it looks like they have terrible information security. Even after the incident with MH17 and all of their special forces were taking selfies in Crimea and Donbass. I mean, just the other day there was a soldier who put a selfie on his Odnoklassniki profile from a cruiser in the middle of the Mediterranean headed to Syria. So I guess my question is, why exactly is it that they keep making your job so easy? Why is it that
Yeah.
Why is it that it seems like many of our adversaries, or even people who aren't in our adversaries, corporations, governments, et cetera, why are they letting this information be so easily available to the public?
Let me take a shot to the last question. So a lot of people are complaining about Facebook on Facebook, and they never leave. So we have to look at this in the aggregate. So while there are little stories of things going cold and Instagram accounts shutting down, in the aggregate, selfies ain't stopping. So, I mean, it's just, you have to look at it in the aggregate. Yes, on certain tactical cases, we get bummed out when that happens, but the trend of selfies and people, of leaving these things in mass, it's just, in the aggregate, we don't see evidence of it happening in mass. There are cases, but this is just a staple of the output and the world that we live in. There are specific cases, but in the aggregate, it's the people complaining about Facebook on Facebook problem without actually turning off Facebook.
Yeah. Are they getting wise to you? Do you feel like?
Yeah, it kind of goes back to the previous question as well about how they can change policy all they want. And of course, they have restrict policy, but you always have the human element, obviously. So, for example, we did a research project on Russian soldiers who received medals for taking part in military activities in the Donbass and Crimea. And we saw this one guy, he was, I don't know, maybe like 20-year-old kid, probably from some village, God knows where, in Russia. And he posted a picture of the medal he received for fighting in the Donbass. And if you look down in the comments, he said, why are you doing this? Our commander told us not to post these online. He said, well, to hell with him. He never told me personally. Right. And I've already gone back to work. I've gone back home. I have a new job. I'm not in the military anymore. Whatever. Right. So, I mean, they can do policy and infrastructure all they want, but you still have idiots who, it's always the human interest. They want to show off. They want to brag. Taking a vacation.
And that's universal.
Yeah.
I think this is the flip side of technology. I mean, you've got, it's so easily accessible now that you can build new services, you can deploy them really fast. They may not be doing a great job, but neither are we. I mean, how many people in here got the OPM letter? Probably just about everybody. I mean, my mom got one too because she was on my paperwork. But So I think it's not just that they don't do a great job, do that great a job either, because policy doesn't always make its way down to the tactical level.
Yeah.
And then it's just somebody just forgets to update their password in somebody's system, and all of a sudden you have full range. So I think this is the flip side of technology being so easily accessible.
Right.
It basically opens up these new venues to create interesting new things. I forget, if you go to Black Hat and some of those conferences, they talk about just, if you really want to get into people's networks, basically set up free porn websites.
Yeah.
They've done this before, and they use the same password there, and everywhere. So there's things like in the intelligence community where we want to be more secure and everything else. All my email addresses and everything I have two-factor authentication, but when I go inside, I can't log in because I'm logging in from a new place.
Yeah.
And I can't take my phone inside. So we actively sort of shoot ourselves in the foot from a security perspective and going forward.
Okay, we have one over here, Colin Clark.
Colin Clark, Breaking Defense. I've got a twofer, if I may. On the one hand, you can share stuff with allies much more quickly and much more easily. But are you getting a good reception from them when they receive it, since it's not all source verified necessarily? And two, speed. Are you able to do a real indications and warnings work faster than the classified side?
So for all the Commonwealth allies are inside of Pathfinder. So it's not just NGA. So NGA kind of provides the core leadership, but all of the Commonwealth participated, the Marine Corps and the Army, and elements of DIA through the Army in the Southern Command. So it was a multinational effort. So all of the analysis is joint. That was done by all of the nations involved. We are very, very fast. So it is joint analysis. It's not branded finished intelligence with agency meatballs in the upper left-hand corner. So our analysis is joint. So the stuff that was made in the coffee strategy that we're going to be unveiling very soon, it is about as joint with a big J as you can get. So the system is designed to be a big tent approach. Unclassified coalitions are not the new secret. So when you're developing networks in that environment, we can grow very broad coalitions. We've had interest from the South Koreans, the Japanese, the Finns, the Dutch have all expressed interest in participating in Pathfinder and the coffee strategy in particular to try to answer as much as we can on the strategic intelligence side at the unclassified level. We're not doing public product lines. We're not there yet. We should do more, and our agency has put things out in the Arctic, but to be clear, the coffee strategy is to deliver secure unclassified to mobile, protected by two-factor and authenticated by government emails. .New Zealand, .Canada, .mil, and things like that. So that's what the plan is. But our analysis is joint. We're very fast, and we're pretty good at it because of that.
How fast can you deliver like an emergent, important warning with that's all source verified to, like a 3-star? How fast would that?
So as far as measuring time, we haven't hit the stopwatch, but because Pathfinder, as far as hitting the stopwatch, but as far as the people that we screened in Pathfinder, we screened for attitude and aptitude, and then people that have a sense of hustle and pound the keyboard. Mm-hmm. So just that spirit is the base of open source. This is not a tools thing. You're not going to, anyone who tells you there's one tool is selling you something. You're going to have 50 open browser tabs that specialize in certain things for the rest of your life. So there is no Uber, minority report thing that you're going to be swirling around doing answers with. So tools do help. But as far as that hustle, the analysis that was generated within Pathfinder is very quick. And we've never done the stopwatch, but as far as getting to very high quality outputs, it's hours.
Hours?
Hours.
John, how do we make that faster?
Well, but I think Chris just said here on the point, the one thing that you're really doing is you're finding people who have a passion for this sort of work,
right,
and want to get into it. And I think that the problem with the way that the government's set up is they find people who don't have a passion and then they throw them into a job that they don't have a passion for either. And so I think that I think that's where we have to kind of change. Is there are people who want to go on certain career paths. They don't want to move up into management. They just want to keep doing analysis.
Yeah.
But they would like to be getting paid more than a GS10
Yeah.
at some point. And so I think that how do you change analysis to where you can actually have people who just do that on a daily basis in the open, who are getting paid for it, because everybody has to make a living at some point.
I think
The
Eric
biggest
would
part
dig
of
being
the,
paid like a GS10.
the big part of this is tradecraft.
Yeah.
It's the human analytical factor of value added, and then the tools are an aid to that. The human aid to the human factor in this. And I want to say that to pick up on something that John said earlier, we're very interested from a defense perspective and from an Army perspective in having good tools, but we realize that we're never going to keep up with the private sector and the way the private sector changes. So we just want to be fast followers in what the private sector can provide us. And we'd like to be able to get to data in one place and not be told that you have to buy the same kind of data, the same, multiple different times. Then that's something I think the private sector can help us with is, understanding that there's a dynamic to the defense acquisition system that is not going to allow us to keep up with all the changes that you have, and realizing that we're just going to, take the best of what you have back and forth, in a dialogue with you.
And I think that future technologies, today's technologies that are today in their infancy, like the applications of machine learning and artificial intelligence to this space could be really huge. And I know NGA has a huge effort in this regard, queuing and tipping, like alerting an analyst that something is happening somewhere that they need to pay attention to.
Right.
But right now, those are still sort of a little bit stovepipe. Imagine what folks like Bellingcat could do with those sorts of AI tools. Is there a push to get those in the hands of more partners? Or is that going to follow the broad democratization trends in technology that affect everything?
Well, as far as a lot of the infrastructure for artificial intelligence and machine learning is open source software.
Yeah.
So the issue is training the computer to see things that a 5-year-old can do in seconds.
Yeah.
So it's not an issue of investing in the tool, it's the training data sets.
Yeah.
So you have to pump through so many pictures, like in the movie War Games, dating myself, but to play 1 million games of tic-tac-toe, and the computer is just watching tic-tac-toe over and over and over and over again, then you can remove the human being and see how well the computer does.
Yeah.
So it's not necessarily that people with a low budget can't do it. You can fire up machine learning things in open source. You just have to have vast amounts of training data to get it to do object detection and things like that. So it's not necessarily cost prohibitive. It's a data rights and just pumping tons of training data through it.
Yeah.
So it's not necessarily a software thing, it's a training data thing.
John, what are the limitations to real application of artificial intelligence in analyzing open source content?
I mean, I think to Chris's point, I think it's really about having that large data set. I mean, that's why Google can find faces and Apple can find faces in your photos, because you have that data, that training set there.
Yeah.
And I think that's where it's going to be really hard for us, because we don't have, we have lots of data, but we don't have Google-sized data sitting around the government. We don't have Facebook. I mean, Facebook builds a new data center, I think, every 6 months, just trying to stay ahead of the volume of data and the storage that they need, which is also why they're going down to open source hardware too, to basically drop that cost of data down as low as possible. So we're not taking that step. I mean, even NSA with all the data they're collecting, they're not collecting that much data. That's being built on a daily basis. Now, most of it is fake news stories are being retweeted. But, I think that it's going to be, how do you live in the open when you want those tools to come in with the executive orders and things we have not to be able to kind of play in those areas, especially when it comes to U.S. citizens.
I think you're the first person I've ever met who said the U.S. government doesn't have enough data to do something.
Easily enough data to actually kind of put together. There's probably enough out there, but it's so stovepiped together and on various. I think that, some of the Social Security agencies' computers are still running on 30-year-old hardware, 40-year-old hardware.
Yeah, totally.
We open source from Pathfinder 1 and machine learning thing with visual search instead of ground photography. We open source that and put it onto GitHub. That came out. So, I mean, we're being as transparent as possible. We want those contributions back from the public and others to help grow that capability. So we open source that. The federal government paid for it, and we gave it back to the people who paid for it. So that's on our GitHub account.
Oh, folks, this panel is out of time. I want to, first, before you give everybody a round of applause, I want to remind you, stay in your seats. You're going to have a conversation with Mary Legere. and my boss. And Mary Legere is, first of all, she's incredibly smart, and she's also incredibly funny. If anybody has met her. But so stay where you are, but give a round of applause to this panel for sharing their insights with us today.